Okay, everyone, we're starting with our focus on assessment, moving out of differentiation. And just as the slide suggests here, we're starting with formative assessment, and then we will move on to summative assessment. And I know that we've already talked about this. You've already created some formative assessments over the past year. So this is going to be a short reinforcement of the basics. But what you're also going to be doing is some reading and visiting a Learn board I created that has links to research on formative assessment and also over 100 different ways to assess your students um, while they are learning, so you can use the information very quickly. So let's get started. With formative assessment process, if it's going to be very effective, one of the key things we have to do is try to help our students and ourselves understand that an assessment does not have to be a judgment. That the assessment should be seen as a learning tool. So one of the things we have to think about as teachers is how we can help students see the assessment as a learning tool, and also go back to, I don't know if you remember from the fall, that notion of mindsets, and that for kids who are in a fixed mindset, for them, any type of assessment, respond to 2 questions on an exit card is seen as they're going to judge me, I'm dumb, I'm wrong, I did it right, or whatever. For a kid with a growth mindset, if they get their exit card back and realize that they missed one part, they see that as, oh, I got information, so next time I'll know what to do. So we got to think about this as we're thinking about using assessments in our classroom. So that's the first thing, right? I know, the thinking, trying to shift their mindset. Another crazy idea is that we don't necessarily have to grade all of these formative assessments. And I know that probably seems counterintuitive because many of you are probably thinking and right now to yourself that students will not do the quote unquote work unless there's a grade attached. Yet, however, there are ways to create formative assessments and build a culture in your classroom that students don't assume everything's going to have a grade. Okay. So with formative assessment, really what the process should do is help you as the teacher and your student be able to answer those 3 questions. Think of it as a process and not a one-step administer this quiz, get it back, and we're done. No, because it should be cyclical. So let's just really quickly review key features of formative assessment. I know you're already aware of these, but just to be on the safe side. The first thing is you've got to have clear learning targets. And I know you've been a really good job of learning how to write clear objectives this semester, and that's another way of saying learning target. But when you're thinking about these, I want you to think about not necessarily small, specific pieces of information that students need to memorize, but those more difficult thinking skills or processing skills or inquiry skills or whatever it is in your discipline that they need. So like clear learning target might be in social studies, because that's what I'm most familiar with. I want my students to be able to construct arguments using evidence. Okay, so that's something they can be working on over a whole entire semester. Okay, so I'm telling my kids, that's your learning target that I want you to be able to achieve by the end of this unit, the end of this semester, whatever it is. The second thing that's important is to show them then, if the target is to construct clear arguments using evidence, you need to share with them a weak example, one that is not doing such a great job of that, and a strong example. So they need to see and not just hear what they're aiming for. Okay, so then once they start with the learning, where am I now? Feedback is a super important part of the formative assessment process. So we need to create opportunities in which we can provide feedback to our students in a timely manner so they can use it rather than getting it back, after the quote unquote unit is done, and that's not very useful for them. And the other thing is, as long as we're giving them feedback, we also want our students to learn how to self-assess. So these can be things like simple checklists that we provide them with to say, oh yeah, I did. That's right. Ooh, I forgot to use evidence here. And we're going to use self-assessment checklists in this course this summer with some of the larger tasks that you're doing, like you already had one for the tiered lesson plan. So let's use that maybe as a model to start thinking about how you can have your kids self-assess. And then finally, after they know what the learning goal is, they've started working toward it, and they learned that, they're not quite there yet. The final part is helping them close that gap. You as the teacher helping them close the gap, and the students themselves taking some responsibility. So we turn again to those learning targets and make sure that they understand, okay, remember, this is what we're shooting for. A student also needs to be introduced to revision. And I know we tend to, when we hear that word, tend to think primarily of revising papers, but I want you to start thinking and help your students understand that sometimes they need to revise their own thinking. It might be around a misconception in science that they believed X was true about force or energy or matter, whatever it is, and now they have to work really hard to revise their thinking. So they have to take active ownership of being able to do that. So we're reinforcing the learning targets. They're recognizing that they have to do some revision, whether it's in their thinking or a product they've created or whatever it is. And then finally, again, here you want them to be active and monitor their own learning. Here's a quick example of a middle grades teacher who, this is how she has her students assess themselves, obviously, as the poster says there. A simple, quick way. I know this might seem too childish or young for high school students, but I was just giving you an example of how we can quickly have our students check in and assess. So hopefully you're getting a hint here that the formative assessment process, if it's really going to work well and be effective, has to have student buy-in and involvement. So some things to think about is, again, going back to what I started with, how are you going to help your students understand the role of formative assessment, and what kind of actions can you take to help them get involved? Now, frequently, we use questions as a way of, quote unquote, quickly checking for understanding. We want to avoid, of course, whatever we, at any possible chance that we can, that whole class Q&A, because typically the same 3 or 4 students respond, and also it tends to fall into this pattern. You, the teacher, initiate, you ask a question, a student responds, you say it's yes or no. You want to try to avoid or break this pattern, because research has shown this is the least effective in terms of, first of all, you learning about what your students know and don't know, what misconceptions they have, and or their thinking process. But more importantly, you typically only interact with 2 or 3 or at the most 4 students when you use this process. So we want to think about how we can increase student response when we're using whole questions as a form of formative assessment. And like you see here, we've talked about these before using response cards. There's lots of new free polling technologies that you can use. I know we've modeled Poll Everywhere a few times for you, but on the Learn board, I think when you get there, you'll see just how many things are available, and it seems kind of, I don't know, like you're a dinosaur if you don't take advantage of them. Okay, so trying to avoid this pattern, trying to get more students involved. And when we get all this information, it's not just for the students, but it's for us to change our practice. What do we need to do differently? So I don't know if you remember Ryan from the fall, but the message here is that we need to use that information to change our lesson plans so that they are better aligned with what our kids need, and also what they know and don't know. So quick review of the formative assessment process. First question, where am I going? So we need to make sure that we have clear learning targets for our students and they understand what the criteria are for success. Typically that means showing them a weak and strong example. During the learning, what it should be, we should be collecting and documenting evidence, analyzing that evidence of what our students, where they are in terms of achieving those learning goals, and then thinking about closing the gap between where they are and where they should be. We need to provide them with descriptive feedback, and they need to know how to use it to revise their thinking or their work. And we need to adjust our instruction in order to close the gap. Okay, so that's a brief overview. I know you've already heard about formative assessment before, but this is going to be our ultimate goal for this module, if you will, on assessment for learning. You are going to create, oops, you're going to create something I'm calling a formative assessment plan. So the first part, and there's lots of directions available in Folio, is for you to think about what assessment activities are going to be like your go-to in your classroom. I'm asking you to, I think, come up with 4 that you would teach your students and train them on how to do these activities, whether it's using Poll Everywhere or whatever it might be, so that instead of it taking a lot of time to get them to know, every time you try something new to get them started, they'll be like, this is part of the procedure and the routine in this classroom. And then the second thing you're going to be thinking about with this formative assessment plan is how can you encourage them to assess their own learning. Before you start writing that, though, you're going to do some reading from Fisher and Frey about formative assessment and a reading response. And then you're going to start working on a draft of this formative assessment plan. The draft, you will be submitting the draft, and I will be giving you feedback, just like we did with the tiered lesson plan. The draft is going to be due on June 4th. And in between there, you should read the Fisher and Frey and complete the reading response. After you're done with that, you'll watch another short screencast on self-assessment and feedback, and then you'll read Grant Wiggins' article, 7 Keys to Effective Feedback, and do the reading response for that article, and then submit your draft of the formative assessment plan for Thursday, June 4th by 5 p.m. Another thing to keep on the horizon, just so you know what's coming up, is that the final draft of your tiered lesson plan is due on June 8th. So again, brief introduction to formative assessment. You've already been exposed to it over the past year, so I know you've got some understanding. What we want to do now is kind of push our thinking a little bit more, and this is probably the area where we typically don't necessarily think of students as being involved in assessment other than having to complete them, but we want them to be able to use the feedback and learn how to evaluate their own work to see how they are in terms of achieving the learning targets. Okay, that's it.